Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us today. My name is Boaventura Monjan. I'm part of Cora Secretariat, also a postdoc fellow at the Institute for Poverty, Land and Agrarian Studies at the University of the Western Cape, and also associate researcher at Centro de Estudos Africanos at Universidade Eduardo Mondlane in Maputo. I'm so glad to join the webinar today, in which we're going to discuss the issue of land and land grabbing, and listen to perspectives from academia and social movements. My job now is to introduce the moderator, Professor Ruth Hall. She's a professor at PLAAS, University of the Western Cape. She also is the editor of the Journal of Peasant Studies, and she also holds a chair on land and agrarian studies in South Africa. Ruth, very welcome, and over to you to perhaps introduce the topic and introduce our speakers for today.
Thank you very much, Boa. I know that it's complex to get this interpretation right. If you are having any problems, please let us know. You can write in the chat a comment if you are having difficulties with the interpretation. It's a great pleasure to be with you today, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. My name, as Boa has said, is Ruth Hall, and I will be the moderator today. Before we start, I think it should be clear to everyone here that even in the way that the languages are organized, this event is about having a conversation across a continent and across linguistic and geographic divides. Cora is the collective for the renewal of Africa, and is built on the idea of building a post-pandemic Africa that revives the spirit of Pan-Africanism and confronts long-standing crises facing the continent. I'm aware that the launch conference last year was attended by many people, so this collective is about 1.5 years old now, with leading scholars being part of this initiative. So this event today is encouraging, in line with Cora's mission, to promote critical thinking around the core challenges of the day in Africa, and particularly to forge connections in two directions. One is across generations, and the other is between activists and researchers. And so I think that that is a very powerful basis from which we are moving. We're trying to promote critical thinking across these different spaces, build the conversation between activists in movements, researchers, whether they're based in movements or in universities, and to challenge ourselves and each other in the process. From the side of PLAAS, the Institute for Poverty, Land and Agrarian Studies at the University of Western Cape, we're very happy to be invited to co-host, and we'll be curious to learn more about Cora and all the connections that we can build, and to promote solidarity and organic relations between activists and scholars. As we start, I want to encourage all the participants, please tell us who you are. We are going to make this as interactive as is possible, given our medium. Please, will you put in the chat your name, who you are, where you're from, and perhaps what organization or movement you're part of. So it will be lovely to see the range of people who are here. Later on, when we get to questions, I'm going to ask you to put your comments, your questions in the chat. And insofar as it is possible, we will promote you to being able to speak as a panelist so that you can ask your question yourself. So even though we have this webinar format, it will be possible for you as a participant to be able to speak. So we look forward to hearing from you. And for this to be a step in a longer process. So please use that the chat and the Q&A. We will be using it, and we will use that as a basis to engage and to give you the opportunity. So following on from this Cora event last year that focused on conflicts and intra-community issues within parts of the continent, it focused very much on resource and land conflicts that were connected with religious and supposedly cultural or ethnic violence. But this event draws our attention to the question of land grabbing and resource grabbing induced by the penetration of capital. This forces us to think about the agrarian question, both old agrarian questions about forms of primitive accumulation, but also new agrarian questions, and to think about the old and the new together. So we look forward to an exciting and lively discussion. As you saw from the advert, we have 5 speakers. Very sadly, Elizabeth Mpofu is not able to be with us today. I will introduce her, however, and we're going to bring her in virtually via a short video. We also are joined by João Feijó from OMR in Mozambique, who I will introduce in due course, Ibrahima Koulibaly, president of ROPPA in Mali, Bernardo Castro from Rede Terra in Angola, and Natasha Shivji from Cambridge University, but from Tanzania. So we will get through to all our speakers in due course. For now, I would like to introduce our speaker who is not able to be here today, but who is very much part of building Cora. And I have no doubt that she will be part of a future event. Elizabeth Mpofu is a small-scale organic farmer. She's also a writer and an activist based in Zimbabwe. She's the founder and chairperson of the organization called ZIMSOF, the Zimbabwe Smallholder Organic Farmers Forum. And she's also been the founding member of the African Women Collaborative for Healthy Food Systems. Elizabeth was the general coordinator for La Via Campesina globally. And in 2016, she was the special ambassador to the FAO, that's the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, during the International Year of Pulses, pulses being legumes. So Elizabeth has been a key activist, not only on these international forums, but also as a farmer herself. And so we thought it would be great to give you just a short introduction to her. She's very sorry not to be here today. She had a crisis to attend to. So with your permission, I will just show a very short video that is a pre-recorded one, not for today, but just introducing the work that she's doing in Mozambique. And after that, we'll get to our 4 live panelists for the day. Please, will you keep moving with the chat? You can go in the general chat or the Q&A, introduce yourself. We're very interested already to see who is here. We do see that the chat has not been enabled. If it's possible to enable the chat, please let's do that, because that's an easier forum. If not, please continue with, in the Q&A to introduce yourself. So with that, I'm going to share my screen, and we will briefly hear from Elizabeth Mpofu, former global leader of Via Campesina and a leader of ZIMSOF. So with that, I will just get this going for you.
My name is Elizabeth Mpofu. I'm a small-scale farmer in Zimbabwe, and I'm also the chairperson of Zimbabwe Smallholder Organic Farmers Forum, which is around all the provinces in Zimbabwe. And we are basically practicing sustainable agriculture, which we have turned to be agroecology, where we are really making use of our own natural resources. The biggest challenges which you are facing right now I can start talking about the issues of seeds, where our own seeds are really in a very critical situation. Our own indigenous seeds are considered not to be healthy seeds, but we know for ages and ages, centuries and centuries, our ancestors have been using all these seeds without buying. You see? But now with the introduction of these GMO seeds, it is a big challenge. Already they are now coming up with laws, seed laws, so that our seeds are really left behind, are abandoned, and we are going to be forced to buy these GMO seeds. You cannot just imagine a farmer who is really near a river, but he cannot utilize that water because of the laws which are already there. I think we still need to think how to tackle these problems, because by campaigning only, I don't see reaching the targeted goals. And we don't want to blame our government. Sometimes they don't know. They also need education. As we also need some education. Education is there, but it is very limited to a few people. What about the small-scale farmers? Who is supporting them? And at the end of the day, we say, our countries, we are hungry. There's no food. That is not the way it should go. We really want the small-scale farmers to get support. Do we really want to sit down with the government ourselves? And I think that is the best strategy. And we'll be able to speak directly using our own language so that they really understand what we really want. We are living in a world with fear, with a lot of threats. Yet we thought the issue of slavery had passed, but it is still there. We thought capitalism has already passed, but it is still there.
Right. So there you have a short introduction
The world is in chaos. We absolutely, desperately need understanding of our deeply troubled human.
My apologies there. With a few glitches, that was Elizabeth Mpofu of the Zimbabwe Smallholders Organic Farmer Federation, ZIMSOF. Participants, I'm hoping that you are able to access, if not the chat, then at least the Q&A. Please do continue to introduce yourself. I also wanted to mention that we are tweeting, and Cora is on Twitter, so you can add your comments, your summary of the conversation and your responses to it on Twitter. If you do so, please could you also tag Cora, which I will put the hashtag into the chat. It is at COR_Africa with a K. And with that, we're going to move towards having our first presenter, and that is João Feijó. João is coming to us from Mozambique. He is a sociologist. He has a PhD in African studies. He's done research on issues related to labor, to migration, and questions of social exclusion and conflict, especially in areas where there are large economic projects and capital is penetrating. He is coordinator of the Technical Council of the Observatório do Meio Rural, that is OMR, where he coordinates research on poverty, inequalities, and conflicts. So, João, I would like to ask you to join us, and I would like to ask you to start us off by talking to us about what resource grabbing and land grabbing are you seeing? Elizabeth already has pointed to the grabbing of seed and genetic material. We know that in Mozambique, there is the Cabo Delgado conflict. There is an oil and gas boom. There are also agricultural and climate-related land grabs. So what are the forms of resource capture that you're seeing? What's driving this, and how do people respond? Thank you and welcome.
Thank you very much, Ruth. I prepared a very short presentation on that issue. Let me start to make a brief introduction about what is. Oh, I'm sorry, I can speak in Portuguese. I forgot. Vou falar em português e vou falar pouco devagar para facilitar o trabalho do tradutor. Eu creio que vocês estão a conseguir ver a tela, não estão? Estão, né? Can you see?
Sim.
Yeah. Ok, a província do norte de Moçambique, de Cabo Delgado, que recentemente tem sido conhecida pelos piores motivos, apesar de ser a província onde...
Professor João, desculpa, pode colocar no modo slideshow, assim vemos melhor todos. Acho.
Vou começar. Então, eu dizia que a província de Cabo Delgado é recentemente conhecida por motivos muito particulares. É o sítio onde há muito investimento no maior projeto de gás do continente africano, mas é também um sítio de conflito militar. Esta província foi aqui que começou a luta de libertação, no norte, foi lá que foi dado o primeiro tiro durante a luta de libertação, mas durante a independência foi esquecida das políticas públicas em termos de investimento e fica no norte do país, e como vocês podem ver, tem as maiores taxas de analfabetismo, né? A população é muito jovem. Portanto, cerca de 14% ou mais de 14% da população tem entre 15 e 30 anos. A maior parte da população vive ou vivia da agricultura, da pesca e do pequeno comércio, mas no início deste milénio houve uma grande procura internacional de recursos naturais. Em primeiro, houve uma grande euforia em torno da madeira, dos mercados asiáticos. Depois assistiu-se também a uma grande procura de marfim e, mais recentemente, de pedras preciosas. Estes recursos naturais inicialmente foram explorados de forma ilegal, clandestina por parte da população, mas tinham um grande conteúdo local, vamos dizer assim, ou seja, criavam muitos empregos. A madeira, por exemplo, o negócio da madeira criava emprego para os jovens que cortavam a madeira, que conseguiam carregar a madeira lá no meio do mato para um caminhão, para aqueles que indicavam o local da madeira, para os donos dos terrenos e para os chefes locais, para os motoristas que traziam a madeira depois para as zonas onde vendiam a chineses ou transportavam para o porto, enfim, para a polícia que pedia o suborno, para os funcionários das alfândegas. Então havia muita gente que ganhava dinheiro com a madeira. O negócio do marfim também tinha mais ou menos estas ligações, ainda que estivessem muitos quadros, portanto, pertencentes às forças de defesa e segurança envolvidos neste negócio, porque eram eles que tinham as armas, mas também muitos jovens que faziam armadilhas para capturar estes animais. Mais recentemente, o garimpo empregou milhares de jovens, que têm empregos arriscados, precários, mas temos os jovens que apanham o garimpo, mas também temos os jovens que servem refeições, os que transportam de táxi, aqueles que comercializam, aqueles que vendem bebidas, a prostituição, o aluguer e o arrendamento de casas. Portanto, a vila de Namanhumbir, ou o posto administrativo de Namanhumbir, onde havia muito garimpo, tornou-se numa zona de grande euforia, muito densificada em termos populacionais, mas onde haviam pessoas que podiam ganhar muito dinheiro e encontravam nestas atividades uma alternativa à agricultura. No entanto, a partir de 2015, 16 e 17, assistiu-se a uma tentativa do Estado de controlar estas redes informais e ilícitas, em parte porque assistiu-se à formalização destes negócios. Portanto, sobretudo no caso do garimpo, o garimpo informal competia com os interesses de indivíduos muito próximos do governo central, que eram também, em alguns casos, antigos combatentes da luta de libertação nacional, e então colocaram as forças do Estado a defender, de alguma forma, os seus interesses económicos de uma forma muito repressiva. E assistiu-se também a uma tentativa de queima de marfim, com vista a combater o tráfico ilegal, e uma chamada Operação Tronco, que era uma operação de fiscalização da madeira. Para além destes recursos naturais, temos a terra. A terra assiste-se neste momento a uma grande procura de terra. Vocês podem ver que todo este mapa mostra-nos a parte centro e norte da província de Cabo Delgado, em que todo o território praticamente já tem alguém que detém uma licença mineira, não é? Então, há uma grande procura por terras para a exploração mineira. Quem procura estas terras frequentemente está registado ou em sociedades anónimas que não sabemos, registadas em paraísos fiscais, nas Ilhas Maurícias, e não sabemos quem são os proprietários, ou são indivíduos muito próximos do poder central, em vários casos são até membros da comissão política do partido no poder, noutros casos presume-se, são testas de ferro de indivíduos poderosos. Então, isto coloca uma grande pressão sobre as terras. No caso de Palma, onde é o coração do projeto do gás, isto criou muitas expectativas entre os jovens. Os processos de reassentamento foram muito manipulados e limitou-se as possibilidades de participação das pessoas, que depois saíram muito prejudicadas em termos de acesso a recursos naturais, portanto a lenha, às praias, aos recursos pesqueiros e por aí fora. Houve uma grande pressão de investimento e uma grande especulação financeira que fez inflacionar os custos, não é, dos terrenos, afetando os mais pobres e os mais jovens, não é? Houve muita gente que ganhou dinheiro com isto, mas a maioria saiu a perder. Bom, isto aumentou o investimento estrangeiro num contexto em que não se produz nada localmente, aumentou inevitavelmente a inflação. A indústria de capital intensivo não foi criadora de empregos. Os poucos empregos que foram criados durante a fase de construção, que foi recentemente interrompida, foram sobretudo preenchidos por pessoas de fora da província, criando nos jovens um sentimento de frustração. Portanto, aquelas elevadas expectativas iniciais, que ia haver desenvolvimento, as pessoas não sabiam muito bem o que é que se queria dizer com esta promessa de desenvolvimento, foram depois frustradas, e é neste contexto que surge depois o conflito armado. Naturalmente que há muitos outros aspectos aqui, políticos, étnicos, geográficos, que não irei abordar porque escapam um pouco ao tema desta conferência. Naturalmente que existem depois também aqui elementos externos, mas o elemento o elemento da falta, o elemento da pressão por recursos naturais esteve muito forte e alimenta inclusivamente o discurso dos machababos do grupo insurgente que reivindica a posse desses recursos durante...
Sorry to interrupt. We
yes,
have lost
I
the
have just finished.
interpretation. No, we have lost the interpretation. Can I just check the interpretation from Portuguese to English?
I'm
Okay.
not sure if I don't know if I spoke too fast.
Okay.
If it was possible for the translation.
Could we confirm, Michelle, that you can do that? We will need to have you unmuted.
Anyway, I was just finishing with the comment that the competition for natural resources, and the tensions that exist locally for this, it feeds the insurgents, and during their doctrination sessions to the people that they kidnap, they always bring all this thematic of the natural resources that belong to us and not for those Kafirs from the Maputo. So the religious speech follows a political and economic speech related with the feeling of social exclusion especially from the young, and social injustice and so on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, João, for that powerful input, which reminds us of the authoritarian face of capital and the relationships between capital and the state. Can I ask you, I know that you are not able to join us for the whole duration of today's meeting. So could I ask you to elaborate somewhat on the ways in which you see the relationship between the state and capital that is now evident in Cabo Delgado? How do we understand this historically? And the relationship between the state, citizens, and forms of property and capital coming in now. Many people will say Mozambique has the most progressive land law on the continent, but we know that resource grabbing of both land and, as you point out, a whole range of natural resources is well underway. How do you understand the relationship between state and citizens and state and capital in a historical way in Mozambique?
Vou falar em português. De facto, Moçambique é um país diferente, por exemplo, muito diferente, por exemplo, da África do Sul. Quando a Frelimo tomou o poder, o lema da Frelimo era libertação do homem e da terra, não é? Então, a questão da libertação da terra e do acesso da terra ao camponês era muito forte. No entanto, no pós-independência, as expectativas de muitos camponeses foram frustradas porque grande parte dos terrenos que pertenciam aos colonos passaram para empresas estatais. Então, a expectativa que muitos pequenos agricultores comerciais que viviam na periferia do sistema colonial e que alimentavam até o sistema capitalista colonial, as expectativas de acederem a esses terrenos e poderem explorá-los foi frustrada, porque esses terrenos passaram para empresas estatais, em muitos casos. Mais recentemente assistimos a uma reversão desse fenómeno, portanto, a partir de há uns 20, 30 anos que os terrenos foram, portanto, das empresas estatais foram cedidos a privados. No entanto, o que acontece é que, apesar da lei de terras definir que a terra é do Estado, a verdade é que o Estado é muito permeável a grandes interesses capitalistas, né? O Karl Marx tem uma frase segundo a qual no sistema capitalista o Estado funciona como um comitê onde a burguesia trata dos seus negócios. Então, em Moçambique, parece que ele estava a pensar em Moçambique, ele estava a pensar no sistema capitalista global, em Moçambique não será exceção. Então, o que acontece em Moçambique é que aqueles que estão mais próximos dos centros de poder conseguem utilizar o seu conhecimento e a sua influência para adquirir terrenos a preços simbólicos que depois colocam no mercado em joint venture com o grande capital a preços de mercado. E apesar da lei proteger em teoria o camponês, na verdade, a lei, na prática, a lei depois há processos de manipulação, porque o camponês não está informado sobre a lei, porque os espaços de participação são viciados, são manipulados, porque frequentemente a polícia de intervenção rápida, a polícia de choque, está presente, intimidando, e porque as autoridades acabam por manipular, né? e por atemorizar as populações. Então há uma penetração agressiva do capital e na prática o camponês não tem onde recorrer, apesar de ser a maioria da população, apesar de poder influenciar através do voto, a verdade é que ele está disperso, ele não está organizado e está longe dos mídias, está longe das embaixadas, está longe destes fóruns, ele não tem quem os represente, não constitui uma força organizada que consiga pressionar políticas públicas que defendam.
Thank you, João, for that powerful response. And what you point to is the ways in which alliances of state and capital serve to divide local populations and foment conflict. So I would like to ask, though, and this is because you're going to be leaving us soon, we would love to get a sense of what kinds of alliances and movements do you see emerging in response? So it may be an incredibly difficult context in which to build solidarity and alliances, and not only to resist, but to try to craft spaces for people to reclaim some resources, to defend the commons, and to push for redistribution. Where do you see politically this kind of energy and potential politics emerging?
Yeah. Eu acho que se nós olharmos na história, em Moçambique nunca houve um cenário democrático que possibilitasse o desenvolvimento de movimentos independentes e livres. Tivemos um período colonial, fascista, depois tivemos um sistema de partido único no pós-independência, que na prática, em termos de direitos civis, acabou por reproduzir e dar continuidade a muitas práticas que existiam anteriormente. Só na Constituição de 1990 é que surgiu espaço para a criação de organizações da sociedade civil. A primeira geração de associações que surgiu eram associações mais assistencialistas de ajuda humanitária. Depois começaram a surgir outras associações de apoio ao empreendedorismo, para a criação de pequenos negócios, num cenário mais neoliberal, não é? Em que o Estado não ia se demitir da economia e deixava-se ao mercado portanto, o camponês teria que investir no mercado e através dos seus recursos aceder depois ao bem-estar, já não seria o Estado a promover. O Estado demitiu-se de funções fundamentais ao nível da educação, ao nível da saúde e por aí fora. Mas mais recentemente surgem um conjunto de organizações, estamos a falar de 10, 15 anos, surge um conjunto de organizações mais direcionadas para a advocacia, portanto, para a defesa de direitos fundamentais, São organizações que surgem sobretudo a partir de Maputo, de um grupo mais próximo do exterior, mais viajado, mas que nos últimos anos cria links e ligações com organizações nas zonas de penetração da indústria extrativa. E tem havido iniciativas muito interessantes de tradução da Constituição e das leis, da lei de terras e de outros instrumentos jurídicos para as línguas locais. Tem havido troca de experiências de indivíduos de zonas afetadas pela indústria extrativa que vêm a Maputo ou vão ao estrangeiro partilhar a sua experiência. Então, tem havido ações de formação onde estas organizações da sociedade civil até divulgam, portanto, direitos fundamentais e acabam por se substituir ao Estado, porque devia ser o Estado prestar essa formação às pessoas. Mas, no entanto, há resistências, há uma desconfiança do Estado em relação a estas atitudes. Estas organizações tendem a ser vistas como organizações opositoras ao regime e organizações incómodas, e então há sempre um conjunto de resistências, de ameaças e de agressões a estas organizações. Portanto, é um processo, mas se olharmos na história, vemos que os últimos 10, 15 anos, não, apesar de toda a conflitualidade que existe entre o governo e algumas organizações mais irreverentes, a verdade é que é um fenómeno único, porque nunca na história de Moçambique houve um período em que organizações pudessem fazer este trabalho de advocacia direta com as populações locais, sem ser através das armas, não é? Porque geralmente a Frelimo teve que pagar em armas porque não havia espaços de diálogo, assim como a Renamo. Bom, a situação é mais complicada no caso da Renamo, mas a Renamo acabou por explorar um sentimento que existia, acabou por explorar clivagens internas ou capitalizar um descontentamento interno para fins militares. Então há avanços e recuos, é um processo lento, que nunca será acabado. A democracia é algo que nunca é definitiva, é algo que os cidadãos têm que lutar por ela, não é?
Thank you, João. I just want to check with the participants. We're now up to 76 attendees, and I'm going to allow just one question for you. Before you leave, if you could just answer one question, João. It's from Chambi Chachage, and I'm going to allow him to talk. Chambi, please, could you go ahead? You've been promoted to being a panelist, so you can put your video on, you can unmute yourself and ask your question to João, and straight after that, we will say goodbye to you. João, over to you, Chambi, your question.
Okay, thank you. My question is really about the issue of the extent in which this situation in Cabo Delgado is a land resources question rather than a religious ideological question. Because from where I'm coming from, I'm originally from Tanzania. Most of the time we have these discussions that are centered on religion, the religious affiliation of the people who are in Cabo Delgado. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Chambi, can you just introduce yourself so we know who you are?
Oh, my name is Chambi Chachage. I'm an assistant professor at the Institute of African Studies, Carleton University.
Super. Thanks so much. João, could you answer?
É uma pergunta muito grande, muito complexa. A resposta seria muito longa. Eu vou tentar ser muito breve e num minuto procurar responder. A verdade é que o grupo de insurgentes utiliza um discurso religioso, não é? Da mesma forma que a Frelimo, durante a luta de libertação, utilizava um discurso marxista. Ou da mesma forma que a Renamo, durante a Guerra dos 16 anos, usava um discurso sobre democracia. Mas a questão aqui é que o grande problema de fundo sempre foi o seguinte, sempre foi a existência de elevados níveis de exclusão social e elevados níveis de injustiça e de ressentimentos históricos das populações. Então, nós quando olhamos para a história de longo curso, quando falo em história de longo curso, falo num horizonte de 150 anos, nós vemos que as coisas não mudaram assim tanto. A economia da África Austral foi construída de forma a que um grupo muito reduzido de pessoas controlasse 90% ou mais dos recursos existentes. E as independências não inverteram este fenómeno, simplesmente alteraram as elites dirigentes, mas não fizeram alterações no sistema de relações sociais. Então, é este cenário que alimenta depois grupos violentos que podem vir com o discurso marxista ou com o discurso da democracia ou com o discurso da religião. Esse discurso é apenas a ferramenta para conseguirem mobilizar as pessoas ou atrair fundos, apoios internacionais, porque na prática o discurso deles depois é um discurso político. Nós quando analisamos os discursos dos insurgentes quando falam com as populações, de facto está lá o discurso religioso, mas também está a crítica social. Está a crítica à corrupção, está a crítica às desigualdades, está a crítica à democracia, entendido como um sistema que permite que os mais ricos fiquem mais ricos à custa da exploração dos mais pobres. Vão buscar os mitos locais, às vezes até de estufa-sangue. Então, o discurso tem uma capa religiosa, de facto, mas deve ser entendido à luz da economia política da religião. Naturalmente que depois há outros elementos externos, mas como eu disse, isto aqui é um assunto muito complexo, que tem-se escrito imenso sobre esse assunto e o assunto ainda não está acabado. Então, espero ter esclarecido, mas eu vou deixar aqui o meu e-mail, se quiser depois pode-me enviar um e-mail, porque nós como somos vizinhos, não é? Eu estou em Moçambique, vocês estão na Tanzânia, e como este assunto é comum, aliás, o problema até veio da Tanzânia para Moçambique, ou se é que podemos dizer assim, podemos depois posso partilhar consigo alguns textos e perceber também um pouco melhor qual é a situação na Tanzânia. Eu deixei ficar um e-mail na caixa de comentários. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, João. I think what you have painted for us is this story of how colonial forms of resource grabbing and oppression gave way to, in many cases, very centralized state authority. And even in particular rural areas, you paint a picture of colonialist states, but then in the post-colonial era, state farms. Sometimes there has been redistribution to peasants for smallholder agriculture. But in many cases, we see colonialist states over time becoming state farms and later privatized. But the process of undoing a redistribution of land is often a violent one. And I think that what we heard from Elizabeth Mpofu is that even in Zimbabwe, after fast-track land reform, there is pressure from the state and there is pressure from capital for the reversal of land reforms. And that's exactly what we've seen over the past 30 years in Mozambique, is a massive mobilization towards a progressive law, struggles to enforce it, but also a pushback from the state and capital. So thank you very much for that. I think that the story resonates for many of us across the countries, and also for offering to be in contact. I think people will take note of your email, and please everyone check out OMR, really a progressive ally research organization working in Mozambique. Thank you very much, João. Off we go.
Welcome.
We will move on. Thank you very much. So we were going to move on to our second speaker, well, actually our third. We are very happy to welcome Ibrahima Coulibaly, who is the president of ROPPA. I will try to say what ROPPA is, but I think most people know ROPPA. ROPPA is Réseau des organisations paysannes et des producteurs agricoles de l'Afrique de l'Ouest, the West African Farmers Organization. He's also working with CNOP, the Coordination Nationale des Organisations Paysannes du Mali. So a leader of both the national and regional peasant organizations. He's a farmer. He works in the fields doing vegetable cultivation, tree cultivation, and farming cereals. Since the beginning of democratization in Mali in 1991, he has been involved with the peasant movement to promote family farming. He's one of the founders of CNOP in Mali, which he has chaired since 2004. In 2014, Ibrahima was appointed the United Nations Ambassador for the International Year of Family Farming. And in 2007, he led the organization of the first World Forum for Food Sovereignty in Nyaleni. So Ibrahima, we are so pleased to have you. Welcome. I believe you will speak in French. And our opening question to you is, please can you share with us what you see in West Africa through CNOP and ROPPA in terms of resource grabbing, land grabbing, and resistance. What are the dynamics, particularly in this zone of West Africa? Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, madame. Merci de cette opportunité de partager notre petite expérience par rapport à cette question extrêmement complexe et qu'est la question de contrôle.
And before you go further, Ibrahima, may I ask, is it possible to put your video on so that we can see you?
Malheureusement, sur cet ordinateur, il n'y a pas de webcam. Il n'y a pas de webcam sur l'ordinateur parce que j'étais sur le téléphone, mais ça ne marchait pas. Je n'arrivais pas donc, j'ai été obligé de venir sur l'ordinateur de bureau. Il n'y a pas de webcam. Donc, je suis désolé, malheureusement. Okay.
No problem. We will look forward to having your voice.
Merci.
Anyway.
Okay.
Thank you.
OK. Donc, merci. Je disais que ce problème de contrôle de la terre et des ressources naturelles est un vieux problème qui a toujours existé, malgré le fait que depuis 2008, on a assisté à une certaine accélération. Et c'est en ce moment qu'on a vu les plus grandes mobilisations au niveau pays, au niveau régional et au niveau international et pour dénoncer ce phénomène. Mais il a toujours existé et je pense que certains l'ont dit avant moi, c'est un phénomène qui trouve son origine dans la colonisation, qui était basé sur un système de contrôle total des ressources et de la négation des droits des communautés et des paysans qui sont la majeure partie qui ont toujours été la majeure partie de la population en Afrique. Mais le vrai problème, de mon point de vue, ce n'est pas ce phénomène récent d'acquisition de superficie. Le problème, c'est qu'on n'a jamais eu une vraie indépendance en Afrique. C'est-à-dire, les gens, on nous a eu une fausse indépendance. On nous a fait croire que nous sommes indépendants, mais c'est les mêmes systèmes coloniaux sont restés. C'est-à-dire que le colonisateur a juste changé de visage. C'est-à-dire, au lieu du colonisateur européen qui vient, qui prend tout, qui dirige tout, c'est maintenant nos frères qui ont reconduit le même schéma que la colonisation. C'est-à-dire, dans tous nos pays africains, nos États fonctionnent exactement comme des États coloniaux qui n'ont jamais reconnu les droits des communautés et des paysans. Je prends un exemple. En Afrique de l'Ouest, je ne pense pas que la colonisation soit restée, aucun colon n'est resté avec la terre en Afrique de l'Ouest. C'est-à-dire, je ne parle pas des autres régions, mais en Afrique de l'Ouest, les colonisateurs sont entièrement partis. Mais ce qui s'est passé, c'est qu'après la colonisation, aucun État africain n'a pris une législation pour reconnaître que les terres appartiennent aux communautés paysannes qui vivent sur les terres depuis des siècles, voire des millénaires. Aucun pays, tous les pays ont continué à travailler sur les législations coloniales qui disaient presque tous, qui étaient tous du même format, bien sûr, puisque chez nous, c'est la colonisation française, donc c'était la terre appartient à l'État. C'est-à-dire que la terre appartenait à l'État colonial. On a fait le shift pour dire la terre appartient à l'État post-colonial. Donc, vous voyez, ce phénomène contenait toutes les germes d'une explosion, toutes les germes de toutes les formes d'injustice, de négation des droits des plus vulnérables. Comme mon prédécesseur l'a dit, les paysans n'ont pas souvent, ils ont beaucoup de difficultés à communiquer, beaucoup de difficultés à faire connaître leurs problèmes. Ils sont marginalisés dans tous les espaces politiques, administratifs, économiques. Donc, ils sont des victimes parfaites de tous les systèmes coloniaux, post-coloniaux. Donc, je pense que c'est ça le vrai problème. Mais ça s'est cristallisé. En 2008, il y a eu cette explosion des crises alimentaires. Donc, en ce moment, les gens se sont rendus compte que la terre était importante et que la terre, c'était une valeur monétaire qui pouvait être extrêmement juteuse. Et donc, on a vu, les gens se sont dit, eh bien, il y a trop il y a de la terre en Afrique. Notre travail, c'est-à-dire qu'il y a des terres vierges en Afrique. Mais vous savez, pourquoi les gens disent ça? Parce que justement, les États post-coloniaux africains disent la même chose. Ils ne reconnaissent pas que les communautés qui vivent sur la terre ont des droits sur ces terres-là. C'est pourquoi les gens sont venus. Et quand ils sont venus, ils ont été accueillis à bras ouverts par les administrations publiques, les partis politiques qui sont au pouvoir, parce que qui, bien sûr, avaient des intérêts économiques et extrêmement importants dans ce jeu. Donc, ils les ont accueillis à bras ouverts et ils ont commencé à les donner des terres, des superficies énormes souvent. Au Mali, si je prends l'exemple du Mali, en quelques mois, on a donné jusqu'à, je dirais, 500 000 hectares. Des terres qui étaient sur lesquels vivaient des villages entiers. Hein. Il n'y a pas de terres vierges, il n'y a nulle part de terres vierges en Afrique. On considère que c'est des terres vierges, mais les gens vivent sur ces terres depuis des siècles. Et donc, on a commencé à faire des papiers et pour dire à des gens, bon, vous avez 100 000 hectares dans cette zone, vous avez 100 000 hectares dans cette zone, vous avez 50 000 hectares. Et donc, les gens ont commencé à vouloir mettre en place des projets de culture de canne à sucre ou d'autres choses, d'irrigation, des méga-irrigations. Si je prends le cas du projet avec la Libye, au Mali, ils voulaient faire un méga projet d'irrigation pour produire du riz et d'autres produits. Donc, on s'est trouvé dans une situation où nous, les organisations paysannes, on était obligés de nous organiser pour faire entendre notre... Parce que nous voyons des drames, nous voyons le nombre de villages qui allaient être déplacés, la violence qui va entrer, qui va accompagner tout ça, la destruction des ressources naturelles qui va forcément être engagée parce que c'est des méga projets d'aménagement où on va tout détruire, on va tout raser. Et donc, on les reconnaît. Et puis, on n'avait aucun dialogue avec ceux qui résidaient, les communautés qui résidaient sur ces terres n'étaient pas considérées comme des êtres humains. Il n'y avait aucun système de dialogue, aucun système d'indemnisation. Donc, c'était, vous partez et nous, on prend nos terres. Et donc, nous, on ne pouvait pas nous asseoir et regarder. C'est pourquoi nous avons organisé des grosses manifestations en faisant venir les médias internationaux, la presse internationale, pour commencer à indexer la malgouvernance chronique qui gangrène nos États, qui fait que ces États qui n'ont pas reconnu les droits des communautés, et aujourd'hui veulent faire des génocides quasiment en faisant quitter par la force ces communautés de leurs terres au bénéfice de gens qualifiés d'investisseurs étrangers qui, soi-disant, devaient venir régler le problème de l'alimentation de nos pays. Mais en réalité, la plupart des projets n'étaient pas des projets même pour des cultures d'alimentation courantes, mais c'était surtout pour des produits, des cultures d'exportation comme toujours. Je pense que dans les pays forestiers, c'est surtout les cultures comme le palmier à huile, d'autres. Chez nous, c'était aussi souvent des cultures de rente pour l'exportation qui étaient ciblées. Donc, on allait détruire les moyens d'existence des communautés qui cultivent des céréales comme le mil, le petit mil, le sorgho, souvent même s'il y a de l'eau, du riz, et qui ont des animaux qui sont des pâturages, et où il y a des forêts, les gens vont prendre, où les gens prélèvent leurs besoins en bois de chauffe. Donc tout cela allait être détruit pour amener un système totalement unique et destructeur, et qui, même sur le plan économique, ne pouvait pas se justifier parce qu'en réalité, économiquement, ces projets n'allaient rien apporter au pays, ni encore moins aux communautés qui allaient être victimes. Donc, on a fait des mobilisations. Bon, la bonne nouvelle est qu'on a pu, la plupart de ces projets ont échoué et se sont arrêtés en chemin, aussi grâce à la mobilisation des communautés, des organisations paysannes que nous sommes. On a fait même des actions en justice contre l'État. Et donc, la plupart des investisseurs ont eu peur et se sont retirés. Et ça, c'est le côté gros accaparement, l'accaparement de grandes superficies. Mais je pense qu'il y a une deuxième forme d'accaparement dont on parle très peu en Afrique, mais qui est la plus dangereuse et la plus insidieuse. C'est ce que moi j'appelle le petit accaparement par l'élite politico-administrative de nos pays. C'est-à-dire, il y a des gens qui sont en ville, qui sont des fonctionnaires. C'est souvent des gens qui sont dans des services de l'État où il y a beaucoup d'argent, les impôts, la douane, parce que vous connaissez le système de corruption, d'enrichissement illicite dans nos pays. Donc, les douaniers ont beaucoup d'argent en Afrique. Quand vous êtes un officier de la douane, vous êtes très riche. Quand vous êtes un haut cadre des impôts, vous êtes très riche. Et donc, c'est des gens qui sont très riches. Si vous êtes un commerçant ou bien même un homme politique, vous pouvez être très riche parce qu'en très peu de temps. Donc, c'est des gens qui ont beaucoup d'argent, qui ont qui veulent investir, qui veulent soit investir dans l'agriculture ou bien se trouver un domaine pour se reposer pendant le week-end. Souvent, c'est aussi simple que ça. Donc, ils vont en brousse, ils achètent de la terre avec des paysans à des prix vraiment dérisoires. Parce que les communautés sont prises à la gorge, l'agriculture était très, très compliquée avec la sécheresse qui est récurrente. Donc, les gens, souvent, n'ont pas les moyens d'existence sont très, 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 très fragiles. Et donc, ils viennent avec de l'argent et ils proposent de l'argent. Et comme ça, ils ont ouvert un marché du foncier. Donc, ce n'est pas des superficies énormes, hein, c'est souvent 5, 10, 20, 30. Bon, ça peut aller jusqu'à 100 hectares. Hein. Il y a quand même des cas où on a vu des gens acheter 100 hectares. Donc, mais généralement, ça ne dépasse pas 100 hectares. Et donc, ils achètent ces terres, ils font des clôtures, ils construisent une maison, ils font un fourrage, et puis ils viennent se reposer pendant le week-end. Ou alors, ils font certains arrivent à investir un peu dans l'arboriculture ou dans d'autres activités. Et donc, on parle très peu de ça, mais ce système est en train de prendre toute la terre, en tout cas autour des grandes villes. Pratiquement, les paysans sont en train de perdre tout le contrôle sur leur terre parce que cette pression devient tellement forte que ceux qui n'ont pas encore vendu sont presque obligés de vendre à cette élite de la ville qui veut ces terres pas trop loin de la ville. C'est dans un rayon de 100 km autour de la ville en général que ça se passe. Donc, c'est quand même énorme, c'est des superficies. Donc, mais c'est des milliers de personnes qui font ces acquisitions à petite échelle que moi j'appelle le petit accaparement des terres. Donc, pour moi aujourd'hui, le problème c'est qu'il faut qu'on se mobilise ensemble pour dénoncer cette malgouvernance qui gangrène nos administrations publiques, qui fait qu'on refuse de reconnaître encore les droits des communautés. On refuse de voter des lois pour simplement dire que les terres sur lesquelles les communautés leur appartiennent. Et on pourrait même définir des statuts collectifs pour ces terres-là pour qu'aucun individu isolément ne puisse vendre la terre sans le consentement de l'ensemble de la communauté ou de l'ensemble de la famille paysanne qui est propriétaire. On pourrait faire des lois très, très progressistes. Et nous nous sommes battus au Mali pour avoir une loi comme ça, mais on a du mal à l'appliquer. Parce que justement encore, il y a beaucoup de blocages au niveau de l'État. Beaucoup de gens n'ont pas intérêt que ce genre de loi puisse être votée et puisse être appliquée. Donc, c'est tout un travail, je pense, de refondation de notre gouvernance, de la gouvernance de nos États qui est complètement sclérotisée, contre-productif et même qui nous conduit dans ces guerres. Parce que quand vous savez, on parle beaucoup de guerres aujourd'hui dans le Sahel, je pense qu'au Mozambique, ailleurs, on voit des rébellions. Ces gens trouvent chez les communautés un accueil favorable parce que justement, les États sont vus comme des oppresseurs. C'est ça que les gens ne comprennent pas. C'est-à-dire réellement, du point de vue des paysans, des communautés de producteurs paysans, pasteurs, autres qui vivent, les États les ont toujours brimés avec des impôts, avec des choses, des pressions, sans leur donner le minimum de droits possible. C'est-à-dire que vous payez des impôts pour un État, mais vous n'avez même pas l'eau potable, vous n'avez pas accès à un centre de santé. Vous n'avez aucun de vos droits n'est respecté. Donc l'État prend tout chez vous, mais ne vous restitue rien. C'est pourquoi ces groupes djihadistes ou autres qui utilisent le label des religions ou autres trouvent facilement un écho, parce que quand ils viennent dire aux communautés, ben, on va vous défendre contre cet État, ben, c'est le vrai visage de ces États-là, qui sont des États coloniaux oppresseurs, au même titre que les États coloniaux avant l'indépendance. L'administration publique africaine est un État colonial contre les communautés, qui détruit tous les droits des communautés, qui ne laisse rien aux communautés et qui est à la base des guerres actuelles qui font que les communautés rejoignent des groupes qui leur amènent des armes pour attaquer leur propre gouvernement. Donc, je pense qu'il y a, si on ne comprend pas, on ne fait pas cette analyse holistique, on va tourner en rond. Les guerres vont s'amplifier, elles ne vont jamais s'arrêter, même s'il y a des victoires momentanées, ces guerres vont revenir parce qu'il y a trop d'injustice, il y a trop de négation des droits, il y a trop de destruction, disons, des espaces, des vies des gens. Et donc, je pense qu'il faut qu'on s'attaque tous ensemble à ces phénomènes. Voilà, je vais m'arrêter là. S'il y a des questions, je pourrais peut-être revenir sur certaines parties plus en détail. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Ibrahima. We thought it would be nice to see a photo of you on the march, leading or being part of a movement. So what you're pointing to, as I hear it, is on the one hand, we're seeing another phase of privatization, right? Once we have had governments privatizing public facilities and other resources, we see now the facilitation of privatization of land, both in the name of corporations, but also to the benefit of local elites. And around the continent, I think this rise of local elites, including politically connected business people and civil servants, is often hailed as a sign of development, that this is about development successes, the growth of commercial farmers in Africa without attending to the forms of land grabbing. I want to move quite fast onto our second speaker. We're going to come back to you, Ibrahima. I hope that you can stay till the end with comments and questions from the chat. People are already asking some questions, and there's some comments from Senegal. I want to mention that among the countries that are represented here today, we have participants from DRC, Nigeria, Mozambique, Burkina Faso, Angola, Senegal, Tanzania, Ghana, South Africa, and Niger, among others. We also have participants from Japan, the US, Canada, and France, including people from those countries, but also African scholars and others living there. So it truly is a dynamic and continent-wide conversation. I would like to, at this point, move on to asking the same question of Bernardo. So I'm going to introduce in a moment Bernardo Castro from Rede, Terra, Angola, which I will introduce in a moment. Bernardo is a founder of the Teachers Union, SINPROF, but also a land justice activist with this NGO, Rede Terra, which I think means right to land. You will tell us. Bernardo has a master's degree and has studied climate adaptation at the Open University of Lisbon. He is an independent consultant on land issues, focusing on sustainability and conflict. And he's worked on climate adaptation, looking at rural communities. He was part of a group that produced scientific papers from the University of Coimbra, Portugal, that presented these in Manchester in the UK at the World Symposium on Climate Change Adaptation, and has also been part of an international research group on social pedagogy with the University of Santiago de Compostela in Spain, also working with scholars and students from Italy, Mexico, Portugal, and Angola. So with this focus on being a scholar who is trying to change pedagogy, but also being a land activist, Bernardo, you're very welcome, and we're looking forward to hearing from you. To start off with, could I pose a similar question to you as an activist and a scholar working on land issues in a country that is also marked by conflicts related to oil, diamonds, and agricultural land, and in a country that has just gone through a recent election. Can you tell us about the forms of natural resource grabbing and land grabbing that you see? And to what extent are we seeing something new or continuations of what we have seen in the past? Thank you very much, Bernardo. You're very welcome.
Ok, obrigado. Sou Bernardo Castro. Como sabem, eu trabalho para a Rede Terra, uma organização angolana com foco em questões de terras, né? E também matéria ligada à adaptação às alterações climáticas. Pronto. Eu vou responder a pergunta que me coloca depois de apresentar a minha pode ser? Pode ser? Eu não tenho retorno.
Bernardo, pode falar, pode falar.
Pode ser? Eu não tenho retorno.
Estamos a ouvir-te, pode falar.
Agora sim, está bem. Bem, depois da ocupação compulsiva dos territórios de Angola pela administração colonial, e falo dos territórios de Angola, são reinos e sobados, essa ocupação foi seguida em muitos casos de desterro de nativos, população nativa. A primeira lei de terras em Angola, durante a administração colonial, portanto, só apareceu em 1838. Em 1907, foi aprovada a lei que cria as terras da população nativa. Trata-se, portanto, de terras reservadas aos nativos e só aparece nessa data. Em 1920, criou-se o instrumento normativo que promove, embora seja o direito de propriedade, o reconhecimento legal de terras de uso comunitário. São as chamadas, designadas na nossa legislação fundiária como terras rurais comunitárias. Na verdade, não são terras, mas são territórios, como já disse antes. E o que se verificou, portanto, dessa herança colonial? Dessa herança colonial, o que nós conseguimos é a perda do direito de propriedade originária da terra, a perda da propriedade sobre os recursos naturais, a perda das fronteiras tradicionais, descaracterização do patrimônio fundiário e fragmentação das relações comunais identitárias em território das comunidades da população autóctone, portanto, a população essa protegida pelo costume. Já com a independência de Angola, em 1975, e de 1975 a 1991, vejam, com a independência, como dizia, nacional, não houve evolução substantiva, à semelhança daquilo que eu ouvi dizer um pouco sobre Moçambique. Portanto, dizia, não houve uma evolução substantiva que se demarcasse da racionalidade e o paradigma de governação fundiária colonial. Portanto, a terra, na lei constitucional de 1976, continua a ser propriedade originária do Estado, à semelhança da administração colonial. Os recursos naturais continuaram a ser propriedade do Estado, à semelhança do tempo colonial. De 1975 a 1991, os cidadãos angolanos não eram sujeitos de direitos fundiários. A primeira lei de terras de Angola independente só foi produzida em 1992, ou seja, com o surgimento da democracia em Angola. E a primeira lei é a Lei 21C/92, de 28 de agosto, que estava muito orientada exclusivamente para regular apenas a concessão de terrenos para fins agrários, ou seja, só conferia apenas um direito ao cidadão, que é o direito de superfície. De 1992 a 2022, o cidadão angolano ganhou, é verdade, mais direitos fundiários com a aprovação da Lei 9/04 de 9 de novembro, nomeadamente o direito de propriedade aplicável apenas em meio urbano, o direito de propriedade só é aplicado em Angola, é meio urbano e restrito apenas aos cidadãos angolanos. O direito da superfície, que é o segundo, o domínio útil civil, que é o terceiro direito, que a lei prevê, a lei vigente, e o domínio útil consuetudinário, e, finalmente, o direito de ocupação precária. São esses 5 direitos que Angola ganhou de 92 a 2022. Contudo, o contexto de gestão fundiária em Angola é marcado pelo seguinte: a maioria da população não tem segurança de posse, uso e uso da terra. E quem o confirma mesmo isso é o próprio legislador, na linha H do artigo número 2 do decreto presidencial número 216/11 de 8 de agosto. Portanto, repito, a maioria da população não tem uso e acesso da terra. Angola não tem uma política nacional de governação fundiária. Existem apenas instrumentos normativos ligados às questões de terras, que é o caso da legislação fundiária. A gestão fundiária em Angola não está entrelaçada ou articulada, sobretudo, com os princípios das diretrizes voluntárias sobre a governança responsável da posse da terra, pescas e florestas. Portanto, esse instrumento de aplicação voluntária, mas é o único que reuniu os maiores consensos internacionais em matéria de governação fundiária. Portanto, os processos e procedimentos de concessão de terrenos são bastante onerosos e com elevado déficit de transparência, num quadro em que o decreto executivo conjunto previsto na legislação fundiária para regular os índices do preço da terra não foi publicado em dia da República, havendo deste modo arbitrariedades na cobrança de preços praticados. Portanto, o preço da terra aqui é arbitrário. A legislação fundiária vigente é anterior à Constituição da República de Angola, que é de 2010. Infelizmente, até hoje, o processo de revisão da legislação fundiária, como dizia, portanto, infelizmente, o processo de revisão da legislação fundiária continua sempre, portanto, não concluído, desconhecendo-se, por isso, a sua conformidade ou desconformidade com a Constituição vigente. A gestão de terras é ainda marcada por uma notória insuficiência das instituições da administração local do Estado, sobretudo em disponibilizar as terras urbanizadas em tempo útil. Há uma insuficiência técnica dos diferentes órgãos da administração pública em interpretar quer a lei de terras, como a lei do ordenamento do território e urbanismo, tendo como consequências as distorções e insuficiências que se registram na sua aplicação. E quem o diz é o próprio governo de Angola, isso no Seminário Nacional sobre a Problemática da Ocupação de Terrenos, que ocorreu em dezembro de 2014. Portanto, essa é a constatação do próprio governo de Angola. As constatações, portanto, que se seguem também são do próprio governo de Angola. E quais são? Acesso ilícito aos serviços de arquivo e cadastro do Estado por cidadãos não autorizados, sublinha isso, que é muito grave, que é a constatação do governo em dezembro de 2014. O cadastro fundiário nacional não é integrado ou unificado, está disperso, o que dá aso ao fenômeno da grilagem de terras e sobreposição de direitos. As queixas sobre o litígio de terras apresentadas em tribunais são tratadas com passividade, desleixo e espírito de deixa-andar por alguns órgãos judiciais e judiciários. Esta é a constatação do governo também em dezembro de 2014. Há um elevado déficit dos direitos à informação e participação na governação fundiária e da articulação entre os órgãos concedentes de terras. Os territórios das comunidades protegidas pelo domínio útil consuetudinário são objeto de captura do seu patrimônio fundiário, quer por empresas nacionais, como por corporações estrangeiras e pessoas singulares. pois o reconhecimento por titulação previsto na legislação fundiária não foi feito em mais de 90% da extensão do território. Há um empobrecimento crônico e conflitos de terras, sobretudo em áreas de exploração de recursos naturais, onde se exploram os diamantes, terras agrícolas para a pecuária, madeira, inertes, etc. Aí há muitos problemas, até mesmo de circulação. Portanto, qual é o significado da terra na nossa legislação? A terra é critério de cidadania, e isso vê-se no preâmbulo do decreto 216/11, de 8 de agosto. Mas também a terra é um ativo econômico que o cidadão angolano pode ter para promover o seu desenvolvimento. Também encontramos isso no preâmbulo do decreto número 216/11, de 8 de agosto. É ainda a terra expressão de identidades e memórias coletivas e territórios protegidos, sobretudo pelo domínio útil e consuetudinário. Mas nós em Angola temos um problema mesmo, que é a grilagem de terras e captura de terras, né? Portanto, como sabem. Em Angola, o fenômeno da grilagem e captura de terras é uma realidade. E essa realidade se apoia, em nosso entender, no seguinte, ou seja, em 5 portas que caracterizam a grilagem. E eu vou citar mais ou menos essas 5 portas que vão mais ou menos fundamentar porque é que nós afirmamos que a grilagem em Angola é uma realidade. A primeira porta tem a ver com o sistema não integrado do cadastro fundiário, ou seja, a dispersão do cadastro fundiário e o acesso ilícito aos serviços de arquivo e cadastro por pessoas estranhas, como se depreende da constatação número 3 do próprio governo de Angola, em dezembro de 2014. Aqui está a grande porta da grilagem e captura de terras através da corrupção do sistema cadastral fundiário. As pessoas por esta porta podem forjar facilmente os documentos, regularizando, portanto, as questões de terras. A segunda porta tem a ver com a passividade, os desleixos e o espírito de deixar andar, com que alguns órgãos judiciais e judiciários tratam as queixas das vítimas, quando os processos chegam ao seu conhecimento. Portanto, essa é a constatação do governo, e como devem entender, as pessoas ou comunidades em territórios tradicionais são as que mais perdem as causas em tribunais quando ocorrem aquelas constatações. As empresas ou pessoas singulares com grande poder financeiro, militar ou político, como já ouvimos aí também em Moçambique, não é? Têm estado a ganhar com isso, portanto, com essa má administração da justiça em matéria fundiária. A terceira porta da grilagem e captura de terras tem a ver com a insuficiência técnica dos diferentes agentes da administração pública em interpretar quer a lei de terra como a lei do ordenamento do território e urbanismo, tendo como consequência distorções e insuficiências que se registram na sua aplicação. Esta é uma constatação número 10 do governo de Angola, no mesmo seminário de 2014. Nós, Rede de Terra, temos estado em anos anteriores a dar formações em algumas administrações locais do Estado para diminuir a iliteracia jurídica fundiária. Na verdade, já tivemos contatos com documentos de regularização fundiária mal decididos, quanto às competências, sobretudo. Portanto, a corrupção de processos e procedimentos em ato de regularização fundiária é o ninho da grilagem e captura de terras no país. Portanto, a outra porta tem a ver com a não uniformização do processo, do procedimento, no ato de consulta às autoridades tradicionais, quando se pretende conceder uma terra a uma empresa ou pessoa singular. A fragilidade institucional ou o déficit de diálogo institucional é uma oportunidade para a captura de terras. Em alguns serviços dos órgãos concedentes de terras, é o requerente de determinada parcela de terra que tem que apresentar uma declaração das autoridades tradicionais. Aqui o requerente pode corromper as autoridades tradicionais ou coagi-las a produzir ou assinar uma declaração a seu favor, sobretudo quando se trata de pessoas com poder político relevante, militar ou outro inaceito. tem estado isso a acontecer em Angola, até porque as autoridades de poder tradicional têm, portanto, nível de escolarização muito baixo. A outra porta tem a ver com a não uniformização do preço da terra e déficit de transparência no negócio das terras. A especulação do preço da terra tem estado a propiciar a discriminação dos grupos ou pessoas com poucos recursos financeiros, favorecendo deste modo, por processos corruptivos, as empresas ou pessoas singulares, tanto com maior poder financeiro, militar ou político, como já dissemos. E quem são as pessoas envolvidas nesses processos? Em regra, o sistema de grilagem é uma máfia, né? Como todos sabem, que influencia de forma despercebida e envolve advogados, políticos, empresários, juízes, altas patentes militares, polícias, autoridades tradicionais, ONGs, ou ativistas cívicos, líderes religiosos, etc, etc. Portanto, estes, como sabemos, falsificam os títulos de terras, promovem negociações fraudulentas, suborno e conluio, condicionam os processos de formação ou tomada de decisão, condicionam a tomada de decisão até dos próprios governos, influenciam as políticas fundiárias e as leis, inviabiliza os processos de regularização fundiária dos territórios das comunidades tradicionais, oculta informações relevantes para a literacia fundiária da população, fragmenta os processos de coordenação e diálogo institucionais sobre questões de terra no país, altera a georreferenciação e os limites de terreno que exploram.
Finish up your input in the next
Sim.
minute, please.
Tá bem. Ok, muito rapidamente, há um estudo que foi realizado por o Raine, o Ernesto e o Daniel, que diz que da terra atribuída, por exemplo, em processo de mega investimentos, de 57 mega investimentos a partir de 2015, numa dimensão de 1,1 milhão de hectares, somente foi aproveitado, tanto a forma produtiva, de 9 mil hectares. Ou seja, para terminar rapidamente, significa dizer que Angola perdeu, sobretudo as comunidades, perderam para as empresas cerca de 3 milhões de hectares de terra arável. Isso é muito grave, né? Eu estou já a correr. Vejam, por exemplo, algumas publicações, são casos que prendem, dentre outros, alguma atenção, dos quais não temos evidências ainda claras se configuram os processos de grilagem ou não de terras. São de parceria, por exemplo, da Ferrangolo, não é? PP, que envolve a Modulax. Vejam, aquilo é uma área de 778,38 km². O caso, por exemplo, da Sociedade Mineira do Cuxi também preocupa não só pelas dimensões, mas, sobretudo, pelos processos constitutivos do direito, mas também pela natureza da atividade que desenvolve, que é a produção do ferro-gusa à base do carvão vegetal, que está a pôr em causa a população vegetal nativa, que mais tarde será substituída pela monocultura de eucaliptos. Portanto, é uma grande preocupação. E, finalmente, o caso da Aldeia Nova, que é claramente uma grilagem de terras aqui. Eu sou dessas terras. A Aldeia Nova é uma sociedade anônima, está instalada sobretudo no município da Sela. Também é muito preocupante isso. Portanto, vou terminar por aqui. Ainda tenho desafios e outras coisas mais. Mas pronto, muito obrigado. Devo respeitar o tempo.
Thank you very much, Bernardo. We will come back to you. Before we get to our last speaker, I want to share briefly, just so that we are aware of some of the questions that are emerging. I will ask the French and Portuguese interpreters also to read out the questions we will be addressing. If you could read those out in English in the next few minutes. For now, I want to mention Nkata from Kenya says, in the context of globalizing social policies, such as the Sustainable Development Goals and the Sendai framework, how would the panelists reconcile the biodiversity efforts like IUCN's 30 by 30 Biodiversity Conservation Initiative and the fate of people who are classified as indigenous? So the question of conservation as also perhaps a driver of enclosure and dispossession. We have some questions in French. I'm going to ask the French interpreter to please interpret the questions that have been raised in French, so that so that all of our panelists can think about those questions, and we'll come back to you a bit later. French interpreter, please, could you read out the French questions in English? Great, thank you very much. So that's Malik from Senegal is asking that question about partnerships. And Nkata is asking about the SDGs and IUCN and the conservation agenda. We also have a question in the Q&A from Joseph Wouda-Mike, who's from Cameroon. It's in French, and also Douada Loefe from Senegal. If the French interpreter could interpret Joseph and Dauda's questions into English, please. Oh, they are nearly at the bottom of the Q&A. Joseph? Yes. Perhaps you could type that question in English in the chat. That would be lovely. So we have questions from Malik from Senegal about resource enclosure, and from Joseph about are we looking at a war between the poor and the rich? We'll come back to these questions. Thank you very much. We'll also hear the Portuguese questions a little later. But if the interpreters could type the questions in English, if the French and Portuguese interpreters could type the questions in English, if you have any time. Thank you very much. We'd like to now move on to our absolutely last but not least speaker. We are very happy to have you, Natasha Shivji. Natasha is based at the University of Cambridge. She's a postdoctoral research associate in the African Studies Center and in the political science department there. She is also the director of the Institute of Research in Intellectual Histories of Africa in Dar es Salaam. She completed her PhD at New York University in the history department, and her work was on the histories of political dissent in East Africa. Her master's research was at the Indian Ocean Studies Center at McGill University, also in history. She has taught at the University of Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, and also in the University of Dodoma in Tanzania. She's taught and researched on Indian Ocean world history, state formation in East Africa, and the agrarian question in Africa. Natasha, we're really happy to have you here. Thank you so much. Your work around land grabbing and the state and the politics of the Indian Ocean and Islam over time is very important in this conversation. Please share with us your research and your contribution to this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here and to hear from everyone. So perhaps I'll start by giving a bit of a context to some of the struggles that are ongoing in the East Africa, but particularly the Eastern African coast in relation to the Indian Ocean world and the hinterland. I will speak specifically of Mombasa, but these struggles are not specific to Mombasa. They take on different forms throughout the region. In Mombasa, the land question is very much pertinent, obviously, but it has taken on the language of politics, particularly on the question of nationalism and secession, and also an ideological question of Islam and belonging, whether belonging to the state, the nation state, or belonging to a larger history of the Indian Ocean world. This language has very often created political alliances across the board and across seemingly contentious classes. And these alliances have often come together in times of political crisis and demands for secession from the state. So my work was specifically focusing on a particular group called the Mombasa Republican Council, whose essential demand was various degrees of autonomy from the state, ranging from federation to secessionism. And their major grievance with the Kenyan state was that it did not comprehend the makeup of Mombasa as a coastal city-state that predated the colonial period and its relationship to the rest of the Indian Ocean world. But more particularly, there was a sense of grievance in that people who lived in Mombasa did not feel like they belonged to the state or didn't have a stake in the state. So many movements took place. The MRC organized in various levels in the late 90s up to the present day, actually. And because Mombasa is predominantly Muslim, and because the MRC specifically was almost exclusively of Muslim inclusion, the retaliation from the state very quickly took on the language of Islamophobia and anti-terrorism, attacking the MRC as a terrorist organization that had external influences, particularly emanating from Somalia and a larger route outside of Somalia. And so they went through great lengths to try and show connections of travel of MRC leaders into Somalia and Somali recruits. These were all fabricated in most instances and were held together by a very thin thread, but legitimized by the kind of American-funded anti-terrorist language. And so using that kind of discourse, the state was able to squash any kind of organization from the MRC. Unfortunately, nobody took up the cause of the MRC outside of MRC and its supporters in Mombasa, particularly intellectuals, organizers, those interested in questions of land. They were dismissed as being a fragmented group without a clear agenda. They were dismissed as being overly fanatical in terms of their religious leanings. They were also dismissed as not having a clear understanding of what a nation was and how a state was organized. And so they gained very little support, and at best they were just completely caricaturized, unfortunately. My work with the MRC revealed quite a few things which I believe are important to discuss, in that many times when we think of questions of land and natural resources, we often look at direct organizations around land and natural resources. And often these discussions are bounded either by space or by the jurisdiction of state. Rarely do they take on a language that goes beyond the state and boundaries. In the case of Mombasa, there were two interesting things that came out of discussions with the MRC and spending time with the kind of work that they were doing. One was that the major grievance was, of course, ostensibly questions of belonging and questions of what a nation comprised of and their longer history of belonging to networks of Islam and the Indian Ocean Network. But it all boiled down to one very specific thing, which started with the Diani, with the building of the Diani complex, which was actually proposed in the 1960s, just before independence. The Diani complex is prime land in Mombasa, and it has been contested by the colonial regime, by those who were leaders of independence movements in Kenya, and later on by the state. Eventually, it was taken over, and a huge tourist resort was built, and tourist facilities were built around it, and all kinds of tours were created, and networks that facilitated those tours in Diani. That land originally belonged, that land that was prime coastal land originally belonged, well, did not belong, but it was originally occupied by several fisher people and those who depended on this land that came from a much longer history that predated even the colonial relations. The reason that they were able to live off of this land without actually owning it or having kind of legal access to it was because it was institutionalized and codified in the colonial time using an Islamic institution called Waqf. That's WAQF. Now, Waqf is what we could loosely think of as communal land holdings, but that is not exactly the definition under Islam. It's much more complex, but much more interesting in that the relationships around Waqf, these are endowments that are made by the Islamic community, and usually they're individuals in the Islamic communities who have certain status and privilege in that community, they make endowments either to the community or to their family. These endowments can take on various forms, but particularly in the case of Mombasa, they took on two forms, that of large tracts of land and mosques, building of mosques. Often Waqf endowments would be made piecemeal to the community in order to protect that land. I mean, pragmatically speaking, it was to protect the land of the privilege against colonial kind of colonial commodification of this land, but also to maintain certain patron-client relationships that predated colonialism. These patron-client relationships developed in the pre-colonial period around questions of slavery, etc. And so the land-owning class that had much of this land during the period of slavery in the pre-colonial period was able to maintain some kind of influence over this land even into the colonial period. These landowners were co-opted into the colonial regime by acting as middle people between the colonial regime and the class that the inhabitants of Mombasa who would eventually be turned laborers, and those were brought into Mombasa. And the way of doing this, because of problems of being able to control and co-opt labor entirely into capitalism that the colonial regime, the British colonial regime faced, they were using this land-owning elite in Mombasa and these ex-slaveholders essentially to maintain this land and maintain a reservoir of workers upon this land. So essentially the laboring class, what would become the laboring class in Mombasa was not immediately co-opted as in terms of wage laborers, in terms of factory workers into the British colonial regime and the enterprise of building a colony, but they were kept as a reservoir. So in times of crisis, you could easily call upon them. And they were sustained as a reservoir, as a labor reservoir, by maintaining these very patron-client relationships. So when we talk about how capitalism finds forms of subsidizing the working class and how that is subsidized through these sort of class divergences within that already exist. This is a perfect example because this land-owning class essentially maintained a reservoir of workers on this land for the colonial regime to use when they pleased. And this reservoir of workers were sustained through this institution of Waqf. And these endowments that were made were for communal purposes. The land was used for communal purposes. So technically, while the endowments were made by a specific land-owning class, by making that endowments, they gained a twofold status. One, they did not necessarily need to have direct control over this land because they did not want to maintain it. So they gained a laboring class that would maintain that land and simultaneously constantly be loyal to this land-owning class because essentially they were clients to these patrons. And they were given supposedly barren land to work on. But under the Islamic institution, it was taken that this was endowed to the community for the sake of religious purposes and charity. And so you had those patron-client relationships be maintained. You had a relationship between a land-owning class being able to maintain their land without actually having to make much effort. But you also had a relationship between what was the colonial state, and as I will show in a moment, the post-independence state being able to maintain the land-owning class as this sort of middle person and a reservoir of workers. And so this system basically was incredibly exploitative to a majority of those who lived in Mombasa and lived off of the land. They were being exploited both by the state and by pre-capitalist kind of relations of dependency. And this double exploitation of this group of people essentially meant that the only thing they could do was grow their tomatoes and their potatoes on this land, and at the end of the day have absolutely no certainty what their relationship to that land was. So when the Diani complex was being built, much of this land on Diani was Waqf land. It was land that had been endowed during the colonial period, because in the colonial period, the British had created the Waqf Commissioners Act, which actually, ironically enough, protected Waqf endowments, in that Waqf endowments could maintain their status. They could not be transferred and commodified under the normal kind of legislation of the colonial regime in relations to land. But that was not some kind of benevolent act on the colonial regime in order to maintain, preserve cultural relationships, but rather it was to maintain waqf because there was no other way out. Whatever they tried, for a very small instance, they tried growing various seeds, which didn't hold. They were not able to control labor in Mombasa. They were not able to get them to work on the ports at the regularity they needed. So there were various obstructions to them being able to control labor and actually control the land in Mombasa. So maintaining waqf land worked to their favor because this land was protected and, as I say, created a reservoir. So they did create the Waqf Commissioners Act so that the waqf was not completely out of their purview. And so this land that was under the Waqf Commissioners Act could be endowed as waqf, it could be maintained as waqf, but certain very significant changes came into place. For instance, these endowments now required some kind of deed, which showed who had endowed that land, to whom that land had been endowed, and what kind of incomes were coming out of that land, which was never the case under waqf in the pre-colonial period, obviously. Essentially, when waqf was endowed for charitable purposes, nobody could own it. It was under the trust of God, under Islamic premises, that only God owned this land, and the benefactors and the trustees were people on earth, but they only took care of this land. But it was endowed to the Islamic community. And so these kind of relations and contestations and the creation of the Waqf Commissioners Act changed significantly the nature of waqf, creating loopholes in which waqf could be commodified if there was the permission of this owners, because owners still existed under these deeds, even though they do not exist under the institution of waqf. So what happened starting from just the pre-independence period right into the independence period was many of these deeds were taken to the Waqf Commissioners Act and converted into title deeds. And when this conversion took place, false title deeds were created, where many, and there's evidence of this, where many of these title deeds now became under the ownership of people in leadership positions in the Kenyan state. It was a classic case of land grabbing. It was a classic case of theft. But this was the process through which it happened. It wasn't a linear process, and because of certain loopholes in certain hints towards the commodification of land, they were able to do this and forge documents where title deeds were created, where essentially those benefiting from the state were able to grab this land and create these very lucrative resorts, and some land was even used for speculation. And so the immediate response for those who had depended on that land for generations at this point, not only through the colonial regime, and this is what I think even further concretized the struggle, because this land, even though the dependency was an exploitative form of dependency, the relationship to that land predated colonialism. And so that kind of connection to that land for people who had lived there for generations, they were basically burned off the land was looted from under their feet overnight, was a retaliation by claiming that not only are we fighting for this land, because they technically couldn't fight for that land, even though they had lived on it, because it was both the waqf and the title deeds didn't have a specificity that they had any access to that land whatsoever. So they use the language, an ideological language of Islam. They say that you do not understand the connections and the kind of networks of Islam that have existed for centuries at this point, because you're a Christian colonial state, you're a Christian colonial central state. You do not understand the Indian Ocean networks and why these lands are so sacred to us in many ways. They hold kind of many of the Sufi brotherhoods that were, particularly the Hadrami, for instance, that were common amongst the coast. Many of the kind of, and Eng Seng Ho has written a lot about this if anybody is interested, the kind of networks and connections that were happening across the Indian Ocean. Many of the sites of worship were maintained throughout the coast, and little is known of the sites of worship that were maintained on the coast of East Africa. And so they used this kind of language to legitimize their claim to this land by using Islam and Indian Ocean networks that predated colonialism and certainly the independence, the post-independent state, to make claim to this land. They were, of course, completely dismissed, as I started off by speaking. The state attacked them as being a terrorist organization. The groups that could have formed solidarity with them attacked them for being very fragmented and overly religious and not having any kind of left leanings, not progressive, very conservative in their religious discourse. And they were also, and interestingly enough, the only solidarities that were formed in this moment were the very class that was exploiting them to begin with, the landowning class, who formed an alliance with the members of the MRC, not the MRC, but members of the MRC, to make a very similar claim, saying that this state does not understand Mombasa, it does not understand the history of Mombasa, the kind of colonial bringing together of Mombasa and the hinterland was fake. In the post-independence period, we should have never been a part of Mombasa. So we claim secession. We don't want to be a part of it. So you had a land-owning elite and an exploited class that was dependent on this land, forming an alliance around the question of autonomy from the state. For the exploited class, the agenda was obvious. This was the only language they knew to try and make claim to the land by arguing that we have an ideological connection to the land. Not only do we materially depend on the land, but for the land-owning elite, this claim was also very strategic by using it as a leverage in order to be able to gain a stake in the state, which is the site of accumulation, particularly in Mombasa, where many of these lands were grabbed by the state. And so trying to gain a claim, trying to gain a stake in that state as by creating constituencies in Mombasa, and saying that this is our constituency. If you do not give us some kind of claim in the state, we opt for federation or complete secession. And of course, the state didn't want such a thing. And so they would allow for token members from Mombasa to stand for elections. And in this way, they could lay claim to it. So being able to lay claim to the state.
I need to ask you to wrap up, please, in the next minute or so.
Sure.
But we will come back to you. So please do.
So this was the kind of network that was forming around the question of Waqf lands, the question of exploitation, the question of dependency, and the question of also leveraging the land issue in order to gain claim to the state.
Thank you very much. We are going to come back to you because I think that this issue of religion and the connection between religion, conflict, and the state has come up in a few of the presentations. It strikes me that some of the conflicts that emerge that we've heard about, for instance, in Tanzania and Mozambique, take on an ethnic face or a religious or an ethnic face, but in many respects are about competition over resources and often are manipulated by the state. What's interesting about your case, Natasha, is that it shows a possibility of cross-class alliances around forms of self-government and autonomy against what's seen as a predatory state. So what strikes me is also we can take this conversation in a few directions. Firstly, we've heard about the details of cases, a little bit about Zimbabwe, quite a lot about Mozambique, Mali and West Africa, Angola, and a part of Kenya. And across all of these cases, what we're hearing is about continuities from colonial forms of property, the imposition of property regimes that deny indigenous forms of property and indigenous forms of land holding. And a great deal of the post-independence land reforms have actually continued this highly state-centric approach to addressing land rights. In this context, it seems that a lot of landholders around the continent are faced with, on the one hand, the promise of private titles in some cases, so a push towards privatizing forms of custom, and in other cases are faced with outright dispossession. Across all of these, what we're not seeing is really a way of democratizing access to land and democratizing governance of land. So I want to ask all of the speakers if you could look at the questions and think about your responses, and particularly if in your responses you could address the question of where do you see alternatives? Where do alternatives come from? Do we see people saying that the alternative is to formalize and privatize? Do we see the alternative emerging as an assertion of common property and forms of local government? And let's also be aware, I think in the latest count, that there have been 33 new land laws enacted across Africa since 1990. So there has been a huge amount of at least top-down definition of land rights, even in the post-independence era. But many of these reinforce state authority or enforce local authority under forms of traditional authority or chiefs. So across all of these contexts, I think that we need to find ways in which we learn from people's own responses and forms of resistance to identify the alternatives. I'm going to summarize some of the comments. If anyone who has asked the questions would like to put up your hand and say your question, please do. I'll keep an eye on the attendees. So put up your hand if you'd like to say your question. Very briefly, Stella is asking you, Bernardo, about how does land grabbing affect women in Angola and how are they responding? The question from Daouda in Senegal, perhaps you could address Ibrahima. It seems to be about whether people are opting for privatization or the titling of small plots. What are the implications in farming areas? Ndiuga has asked about what are the connections or potential for alliances across African and Latin American movements, social movements and peasant movements? And then we also have the questions from Joseph in Cameroon about whether do we see a prospect of war between the poor and the rich? Or perhaps you would like to comment, any of you, whether you see conflict as emerging along class lines or religious, ethnic lines, or indeed between pastoralists and cultivators. And are there cases where, as Natasha has pointed out, where instead of different classes of cultivators, pastoralists, and others being in conflict with one another, that they are actually contesting the authority of the state? So with that, I want to hand over back to our speakers. Could we start with you, Ibrahima? If you could respond to the question about the connections between African and Latin American movements, and also what you see as being the emerging alternative. Your own movement has pushed for seed sovereignty, land sovereignty, food sovereignty. Where do you see this taking root, and what is the next phase of organization and resistance?
Merci bien. Par rapport à la question de quelles sont les connexions que nous devons faire, ces connexions existent, je pense, déjà dans une certaine mesure à travers certains grands mouvements paysans comme la Via Campesina et d'autres mouvements, d'autres espaces, les espaces au niveau du mécanisme de la société civile. Mais peut-être qu'il faut travailler à se donner une direction plus agressive dans notre façon d'aborder ces problèmes et de les présenter afin qu'on soit mieux écouté. Parce qu'en réalité, je pense que la qualité de l'écoute est le vrai problème que nous avons. Et au niveau du mécanisme de la société civile, il y a beaucoup de réflexions qui ont été déjà faites sur ce problème d'agrocarburants, d'accaparement des terres, tout ce qui contribue à fragiliser les droits des communautés. Et bien sûr, il y a eu les directives volontaires pour la gouvernance foncière qui ont été un grand moment, mais malheureusement, leur caractère non contraignant fait que beaucoup d'États ne sont pas en train de faire des grands progrès. Mais je pense qu'il y a urgence aujourd'hui à avoir des résultats concrets par rapport à ces problèmes d'accaparement des terres, permettre à ce que ce qui doit prévaloir, c'est que les droits basiques des communautés ne soient pas violés impunément. C'est extrêmement important. Mais au sein même des communautés, il faut reconnaître qu'il y a des problèmes très sérieux. C'est que souvent, c'est au sein de la famille qu'un membre de la famille va vendre une partie de la parcelle à quelqu'un qui a de l'argent sans consulter les autres membres de la famille. Donc, la personne qui a posé la problématique de est-ce qu'il faut des droits collectifs? Oui, nous, on se bat pour des droits collectifs. Parce que si on va vers des droits individuels, je pense qu'on ouvre un marché anarchique de foncier au niveau des communautés. Et donc, les communautés vont perdre tout contrôle sur les terres parce qu'il y aura un marché anarchique qui permettra une vente des terres de n'importe quelle manière. Et je pense que ça va être un drame dont on ne pourra pas s'en sortir. Donc, je pense qu'il faut baliser à travers des droits collectifs. Ces droits collectifs peuvent être à plusieurs niveaux. D'abord, au sein des exploitations agricoles familiales, ça doit être clair qu'une terre qui appartient à une famille appartient équitablement à tous les membres de la famille et qu'aucun membre, fût-il l'aîné de la famille ou le père de la famille, n'a le droit de vendre la terre de la famille sans que tous les membres aient signé un document pour donner leur aval. Donc, je pense que ces mécanismes simples peuvent permettre d'empêcher l'émergence de ce marché anarchique qui fragilise, qui fait qu'en sorte souvent certaines familles se trouvent même sans terre à cultiver pour leur nourriture. Et je pense que l'autre chose, c'est d'avoir des espaces collectifs communautaires, notamment les espaces où les gens vont faire du pâturage ou vont couper le bois. Ça doit être des espaces avec des droits collectifs. Il ne faut pas, à mon avis, aller dans le sens d'avoir des droits privatifs sur des espaces où les animaux vont paître, où les gens vont couper du bois souvent pour leurs besoins de bois des choses. Je pense qu'il y a moyen de faire des législations qui permettent effectivement de baliser les droits en ce sens-là. Bon, oui, les traditions, la question des traditions qui sont affectées est une réalité aujourd'hui. Vous savez, nous ne sommes plus dans les valeurs séculaires de nos communautés, sinon il n'y avait pas la vente de la terre était inimaginable il y a juste 20-30 ans. Dans des pays comme le Mali, qu'un paysan vende une partie de la terre de sa famille, mais aujourd'hui, c'est devenu banal. Donc, ça veut dire que les traditions se sont érodées. Et donc, au niveau de l'autorité des chefs traditionnels aussi, c'est beaucoup érodé. Les chefs de terre, les chefs de communauté qui ne vendaient pas la terre, mais qui donnaient la terre à tous ceux qui en avaient besoin pour leurs moyens d'existence, n'ont pas d'autorité. Et donc, tout ça, c'est des phénomènes qui sont dus à la croissance de la population et puis à l'avènement d'un certain nombre de phénomènes dits modernisation, mais qui ont cloisonné les êtres humains et qui fait que chacun fait à peu près ce qu'il fait. Donc, chacun fait à peu près ce qu'il veut. Donc, pour essayer de régler ça, il faut des législations qui encadrent les choses. Et les États sont très frileux à élaborer ces législations. C'est ça qui est dommage. Je pense qu'il faut faire de la pression aujourd'hui pour que chaque État, au niveau de chaque pays, il y ait un processus pour mettre sur la table ces questions, d'avoir des législations très claires, pas sujet à interprétation, parce que souvent on fait des législations très floues qui permettent juste encore de continuer à faire la même chose qu'on a toujours fait, mais des législations très claires, simples à appliquer et qui permettent justement d'empêcher que la terre quitte son usage pour produire la nourriture.
Going to come back to you.
Oui.
Mm-hmm.
Oui. OK, d'accord, j'ai fini. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. Thank you, Ibrahima. So this question of the state is absolutely central. Can I ask you, Bernardo, if you could also respond to some of the questions? There was a question about the impacts of land grabbing on women and how women are responding. Also about whether the conflict takes the form of between the poor and the rich, or between conflicts among rural people. I also see in the chat that there's several questions, one of which is about water, that surely the next resource to be grabbed is water. I think that has already happened, that a lot of the resource grabbing is motivated by control over water, including for irrigation and other purposes. Perhaps you could comment on that. And finally, also you might be able to comment on the question of whether people are mobilizing and organizing collectively. Thank you, Bernardo.
Ok. Bem, obrigado. Vocês devem já saber os problemas que Angola ultimamente tem estado a viver. Nós temos, com muita recorrência, os ciclos cada vez mais intensos da seca, sobretudo no centro e sul da Angola. Há muita gente que morre, há muito gado que se perde, sobretudo em comunidades cuja ocupação tradicional é a pecuária, né? Então, a luta por recursos hídricos, conflitos que se prendem com a água, nos parece que no atual quadro das alterações climáticas, sem sombra de dúvida, será o maior problema que nós teremos no país. As iniciativas que temos para combater essa situação são bastante insuficientes ainda, e as respostas a esses problemas também não são coletivas. Portanto, as respostas são de alguma forma fragmentadas e não há, digamos assim, uma resposta articulada entre a sociedade civil, que é muito ativa na proteção dos direitos, digamos assim, daquelas populações que sofrem muito com a usurpação de terras e a seca, e o próprio governo. Isso para nós é preocupante. Agora, é certo que nessa luta, sobretudo de conflitos de terras, quem perde mais são as comunidades em meio rural, que têm estado a sofrer permanentemente, estar a verificar constantemente a destruição do seu patrimônio geohistórico, ocupação, portanto, de grandes extensões dos seus territórios. Portanto, a população mais empobrecida é que sofre. E no meio disso tudo, obviamente, é a mulher que acaba por sofrer mais. Porque a mulher vive mais no campo, é a pessoa com pouca escolarização, é a pessoa mais ativa na economia doméstica, mas que essa economia doméstica é assolada por permanente clima de insegurança de posse, digamos assim, dos seus recursos. Isso para nós é preocupante. Agora, a mulher, no nosso país, existem algumas organizações ativas nesse sentido, mas ainda há muito déficit de respostas coletivas da mulher a essas situações. Sabe que a mulher é muito discriminada no acesso e uso da terra. Portanto, as respostas ainda não são, porque mesmo no próprio meio rural, no quadro do próprio costume, a mulher ainda sofre, portanto, dessa discriminação em matéria de acesso e uso da terra. Portanto, isso é uma realidade. Agora, espero que me estejam a traduzir corretamente. O grande problema, de fato, que nós estamos a viver é esse choque entre aqueles que têm maior poder financeiro, militar ou político, que têm estado a ocupar de forma recorrente e grandes extensões um pouco por todo o território, e o Estado não estar a fiscalizar esse processo. Este é o grande problema que nós temos no país. Portanto, a nossa lei prevê que se disciplinem, que se regulamente as formas de ocupação, mas isso não tem estado a ser uma realidade. Portanto, não sei se me escapa alguma pergunta, mas nós ainda temos muitos problemas, efetivamente, sobretudo na questão de terras, E eu acho que há que repensar um pouco o paradigma do uso da terra. E é um problema muito sério. Não sei se alguma pergunta me escapa, sobretudo em relação ao uso, ao controle do, sim, ao controle dos recursos naturais.
Thank you, Bernardo. Bernardo, thank you. So what we're hearing, I think, is two quite different things in different contexts. In some cases, you have a state that is absent, doesn't enforce laws, is not supporting, but in other cases, an actively violent state that is intentionally displacing people. So also the ways in which movements strategize around the law and the state seems quite varied. Natasha, would you like to respond to any of the comments?
Mas é o que acontece em Angola.
Oh, hold on. Could we just have quiet. Thank you so much. In a moment, I'm going to allow Nkata, one of the participants, to speak. But Natasha, if you would like to perhaps reflect on what you see, do you see any threads of connection across the different experiences and stories we've heard up to now? And to what extent do you think the Waqf experience in Mombasa represents an alternative? You know, I mean, are people really looking to an alternative? Can we learn from that?
Thanks. I think that the question of the state is predominantly clear in everyone's response. And in the case that I just spoke about in Mombasa, I mean, not only is the state clear, but the very language of organizing is taking on one that is legible to the state. The state pretends in many ways not to understand the question of land and relationships to the land. And I think in Mombasa, what has happened, as I'm sure in many other instances, because of that inability to connect the question of land and the relationship that groups have to land that cannot be codified and commoditized by the state, the language is very apparently taking on that is one that is legible to the state, that if you do not meet our demands and our grievances, we will secede. And that language is very legible to the state, and the state can attack and retaliate on those fronts. So the relationship that displaced groups of people have, the relationship that they have to the land, whether it be pre-colonial kind of dependency relations or communal land holdings, whatever it might be, making that language legible to the state seems quite paramount in forms of organizing. The problem with that is once you convert that language into one that is legible to the state, it gets caught into the kind of constructs and boundaries that the state offers in terms of laws. And in the case of Mombasa, the reason I was trying to very much emphasize the alliances, the false alliances that were being formed across two classes that had very different interests, was because once it translates into questions of legality and ownership and deeds, it very quickly becomes a very co-optable struggle. So I think that our response to how these relationships to the land can be maintained in a way that is beneficial to the peasant and the working people has to be first understanding how do people organize and what is their relationship to the state? How do they understand the state and its role in these land holdings? And sometimes we might find solidarities beyond simply movements that are explicitly around the question of land. We might find solidarities with people who are seeking kind of political claims. In this case, we might find solidarities with along various lines and prevent the kind of co-optation by the land-owning elite in this case. And I don't think things like Waqf necessarily provide an alternative, because they are exploitative in of themselves and do hold in them the germ of some very dangerous tendencies, which is which can really take it in a completely different direction. But I do think that it hints at different strategies of relating to the land that can only be implemented by some form of local governance, like some have mentioned already. And that form of local governments cannot be subordinate to the central state. That form of local government must be formed in a way that is truly not representative, but grounded within the communities. And it must be formed in a way that has complete autonomy to make certain decisions around these lands, that is essentially there to protect these lands. What form and what legislation will need to be passed, of course, those are practical and pragmatic discussions, and the form of organizing only can tell. But I think the ultimate goal has to be what kind of state is in place and what relationships to that state need to evolve, and what kind of forms of governance need to evolve outside of it. Not necessarily going back to the pre-capitalist period, which creates problems of its own, but acknowledging that people are organizing, and there are hints and tendencies that this way is not working. And they're organizing using a variety of languages, which is why I thought it was important to bring this particular case up, because the language does not always take on the language of access to land. It doesn't always take on the question of land rights. It takes on various languages. In this case, it takes on the language of Islam, it takes on the language of the Indian Ocean, it takes on the language of secession, etc. But the core issue is land, and I think we find that in most cases. I also wanted to address the question of women, which almost feels it has to be centered. But the relationship that women have to land, and I think this is an interesting point of struggle, particularly when we're thinking of the kind of languages that are used, is not always explicit. And even though certain measures need to be put in place to protect women who are more exploited than the men off of the land for various reasons, and the way the colonial regime worked, etc., we sometimes have to take into consideration how that relationship to the land functions. So for instance, in the case of Mombasa, many of the endowments were made by women. They were made by women because it was a way for men to protect their families after their passing, by ensuring that the women had some control over the land through these religious institutions. So many of these endowments were made by women. But in the process of using waqf in order to get some kind of stake in the state, the man would intervene. The people who were being exploited off of this land often tend to be obviously women and men, but the women would very often form solidarities with the families of those who endowed the lands, in order to be further protected against the man who would leave the land to join the MRC. So the complications of how these solidarities and relationships are formed are sometimes not always visible to our formulas about what we can do in order to protect lands. So as much as I agree with the question of local governments, and as much as I agree to finding ways in which people can express the relationship to the land outside the state, I think it's imperative that we understand the specificities of these grounded struggles, because a lot of unexpected answers, a lot of unexpected solutions and unexpected movements are arising from it that we're not really able to formulaically predetermine.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Natasha. We are coming towards an end, but I want to congratulate the attendees who are still here for staying with us for so long, nearly 2.5 hours, but we only have a few minutes left. And I want to give an opportunity just for two further comments. One is just to read out the comment from one of the participants. It is, I think his name, it may be him. It is Nigel, who says the political mission of the African microstate, Anglophone, Francophone, Lusophone, is to serve the interests of the Western multinationals that are on the continent for an Africa without Africans. So perhaps alerting again to sort of long historical relations of imperialism. Then we also have one participant who wanted to ask a question, but I am not sure that I can find him right now. If you were the person who put your hand up, please do so again. I want to suggest that perhaps there are three things that have stood out very powerfully. One is the need to really critique and understand the structure and interests of the state, and to do so both historically, to ground that understanding in a history of the construction of states in colonial contexts and the continuities in those state formations and relations with classes in society, and also understand the state in relation to global interests and the people who inhabit the state and their relations to imperial interests. And the second is to find ways of supporting struggles in critical ways, not uncritically, but defending struggles against co-optation. I think that it's been powerful that we've heard about specific struggles that are about access to resources, access to food, livelihoods, and for struggles for recognition that can quite easily be co-opted into narrow, chauvinist, racist, patriarchal, and violent forms. So defending the legitimate struggles of people to retain access to resources against co-optation. And the third is to support local governance, but again, not uncritically, and to look for those spaces where there are commons, where people are fighting to defend or expand forms of common property resource, forms of access to natural resources. So those seem to be three things: understanding the state and its history and its imperial character, but also defending struggles against co-optation and critical engagement with and support of local governance and the defense and expansion of commons. To my mind, that seems like a powerful agenda that feeds into the ongoing Cora conversation. My understanding is that this is a forum where we are trying to build both deeper understanding of our own and each other's contexts, but also trying to really build solidarity and impetus towards alliances across movements, between researchers and movements, and to have this as an ongoing conversation. So I'm going to pull towards an end now. I think that there may be a few announcements to be made. In short, I understand that there is to be a further webinar organized by Cora. And I think that with your permission, those who registered to attend today's event can be notified so that you can choose whether or not to attend. The next event will be on the 29th of September, and it will actually look at African languages, the circulation of African languages in African public space, with, again, a diverse array of speakers from across, again, different language areas of the continent, and the speakers will be announced in due course. So on next Thursday, the 29th of September, the time will be announced and confirmed. That will be the next Cora event. And beyond that, I think that we can firmly say that we have heard from several countries, both from the presenters and the participants, showing that the annexation, privatization, and accumulation of capital and wealth on the basis of land grabbing and natural resource grabbing continues in various ways across the continent, partly driven by external forces to the continent, crises of capitalism elsewhere, in financial markets, in commodity markets, but also within the continent, and the ways in which class formations and interests have control over the state. So with that, I think that it certainly means that Cora has an ambitious and important agenda. I would like to thank very much the speakers from today. Our greetings to Elizabeth Mpofu from Via Campesina and Zimsof, and we were sorry that she couldn't join us, to João Feijó from OMR in Mozambique, to Bernardo Castro from Rede Terra in Angola, from Ibrahima Koulibaly from Mali, and Natasha Shivji from Tanzania and the UK, We are deeply grateful for your contributions today. An announcement that also this event has been recorded. It will be made available. You will get notification, I understand, as to how you can access this recording. Several people have asked. And also that information will indicate whether you can access translated versions of this recording. Please do check out the Cora Twitter account to see what the conversation has looked like, because many people who are not part of today's conversation have been interacting with it on Twitter and also on Facebook. Somebody is asking in the chat for a contact. Perhaps one of the organizers could provide a contact so that we can notify you of future events. I think that all that remains for me to say is that land issues are clearly absolutely central to the ongoing and unfolding struggles, not only in rural areas, as one participant mentioned, in urban areas as well, which raises profound questions about the kinds of alliances in resistance and alliances for alternatives. So thank you to Cora for this opportunity. Thanks to our speakers. Thank you to our attendees and to our amazing interpreters, and as well to Dr. Boaventura Monjane, who has convened this event on behalf of Cora, and to Ghislaine and Lionel and others from Cora. So thank you very much, everybody. And we will be in touch again, and we will share right now in the chat the contact details so that you can keep in touch. Thank you.